Hello friends, Hank here, and to recognize this anniversary of the D-Day landings in Normandy some 80 years ago today, we're going to pay special tribute to the brave men that contributed to the success of that day of days. I'll take you through the process of how I made this small diorama entitled Thank You, Old Friend, as we honor both the brave men who made it home and those who shall forever remain interred within the hallowed grounds of the Normandy American Cemetery in Colleville-sur-Mer. The first step in this project was to create two figures for our narrative scene, an older gentleman veteran and the spirit or memory of his old comrade in arms. To create our veteran, I leveraged some pieces from this Masterbox civilian kit. Using parts from two separate figures in the set, I managed to build up this nice old man with a cane, sweater, and cap without much fuss. For our spirit, I chose to use this 3D printed resin paratrooper figure from H3 Models. After carefully removing all the parts from the printing supports, this highly detailed figure builds up quite nicely with a bit of super glue. With both of our figures assembled, it was time for some painting. I started off with our spirit. As always, I sprayed the entire figure with a coat of black primer. I wanted to achieve a very simple two-tone black and white shadow effect for this figure, almost as if he were a memory from the past in the mind of our old veteran. By spraying a bit of satin white paint straight down on our figure, I was able to pick out just the highlights of this beautiful sculpt and create this almost ghostly sensation. Pretty simple stuff, honestly, and it really allows you to appreciate the quality of the figure himself. With that two-tone effect completed, all I had to do now was just seal in our paint with a bit of matte varnish. Moving on to our veteran, I also went ahead and sprayed him up with a base coat of flat black primer before moving on to our skin tone work. I used my tried and true Faces Made Easy technique here. If you'd like a more in-depth tutorial on face painting in 1/35th scale, I'll link to my lesson on the subject right here. After applying my first coat of flesh tone on the face, I was sure to block in his exposed arm and hand here as well. While that first coat of flesh paint dries, I blocked in our gentleman's khaki pants. I also went ahead and painted in his sweater with some German field gray. The colors you choose are totally subjective, of course, as these are just civilian clothes rather than a proper uniform. Back to our skin here, I went ahead and gave our gentleman a glaze of light rust to help add a little life and color to his flesh. And while that wash dried, I headed down here and painted in his boots with some red leather. Next up, I tackled his hair and mustache. I chose a little off-white creme of ice because I wanted that grayish white hair to show his age without looking too artificially white. For our final skin effect, I took our first flesh tone once again, watered it down a bit, and glazed that over some of the raised portions of the face to pull out our highlights. Off camera here, I went ahead and painted in his shirt with some medium blue, close quarters in there around the neck, so I had to get my face right up in there to actually get the paint job complete. We also have to paint his cap, of course. I chose a little beige brown for this. And last but not least, I painted his cane with a bit of chocolate brown. With our painting work complete, I sprayed our figure with a coat of gloss varnish to seal in our acrylics and prepare for a bit of weathering. I used this simple sludge wash here. I coated our figure with some enamel dark wash and let that flow into all the nooks and crannies and details of our sculpt. And then I used our odorless thinner to remove any excess from the raised portions of our sculpt while creating some convincing artificial shadows in the recesses of his clothing and facial features. Once our weathering work was completely dry, I hit our figure with one final coat of matte varnish to protect all of our work. With both of our figures complete, I turned my attention to the diorama base itself. First up, I needed to create some headstones to represent just a few of the beautiful stones that mark the nearly 9,400 servicemen interred at the Normandy American Cemetery. I decided to use this EVA craft foam that I had on hand to cut out some of these crosses. I tried to scale these down to measure about waist high on our figures, which is roughly the height of the actual stones. This was a real learning experience for me. I've never attempted to make anything like this before, so there was a bit of trial and error along the way. I will say, at this point, I also decided to stick with just crosses for the headstones in this particular diorama. At the time of the cemetery's dedication, the US military only recognized 3 religious denominations: Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish, and as such, there are some 151 markers in the shape of the Star of David throughout the cemetery in Normandy. This EVA foam proved to be quite difficult to work with, so I chose to stick with the basic Latin cross shape rather than make a poor attempt at one of the Jewish markers. Once I made a marker that I was satisfied with, I used it as a template to trace out a handful more crosses to cut out as well. Cutting the foam with my craft knife was a little tedious, but I eventually found that longer, more forceful cuts left me with the cleanest headstones. Eventually I had produced enough crosses to start working at my placement, so I chose the best iterations and set the rest aside as spares. One of the most striking features of the Normandy Cemetery, in my opinion, is the seemingly endless grid of stones. The balance and precision of it all is beautiful in its own right. To start placing our stones, I first needed to choose a base for our diorama. I selected this stained wooden circle base that I'd prepped for an older project. I began by marking in a grid of sorts for where I wanted these stones to go. I first drew an X slightly off center from the base circle itself. We can't have things looking too perfect, can we? Looking at images of the Normandy Cemetery, the stones appear to be a little bit more than 7 or 8 feet apart, so I used one of my figures as reference to judge the distance between the stones in the diorama. Turned out to be just about 8 centimeters. Once I had my 5 locations plotted for my headstones, I went ahead and glued those into place with some super glue, ensuring that they were nice and plumb aligned with each other. Before I moved on to painting my base, I wrapped a bit of masking tape around the sides of the base to keep those clean. With the base painting itself, again, this was a bit of trial and error. I started out by priming the upper surface of our cemetery with some black and following that up with some olive drab. After I started painting the headstones with some satin white, however, I had to adjust my plans a bit. First off, the overspray was a bit too much. I probably should have painted the stones before I mounted them. Oops. And secondly, this EVA foam proved to be quite difficult to paint. The dye in the foam kept sapping through multiple layers of paint and leaving this weird blue tint. Eventually, I ended up brush painting about a dozen coats or so of cheap acrylic white paint over the stones before I was finally satisfied with the finish. Ultimately, all these layers of relatively cheap paint ended up looking a bit like white stone, so it all worked out. I bailed on my initial painting plan for the base terrain and ended up brush painting some black acrylic paint over the whole thing. I estimated that the static grass I was planning on using would look pretty good over the dark black soil, and it did turn out quite well, so we'll see that in a moment. To layer in the static grass, I first brushed a nice thin layer of PVA glue all over the base and then sprinkled all the grass over the surface of the diorama. After the glue had dried completely and I'd shaken off the excess, I was quite happy with this well-manicured grass effect. The very last step of this project was to mount our 2 figures in place. I set them each slightly off-center of the central headstone, almost as if our older veteran here could picture and was having a conversation with his old friend from many years ago. And with that, my diorama was complete. I hope you all enjoyed this project. It was a quite rewarding experience for me, both as a learning opportunity and to honor the ever-dwindling number of World War II veterans that we're lucky enough to still have with us today. If you're new to the channel, welcome aboard, folks. We've got new scale modeling and history lesson videos coming out each and every week. And until next time, my friends, be well, happy building, cheers.